welcome everyone to today's webinar. Reach your customers with innovative and compelling storytelling. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. And hello to everyone else who's catching up with the recordings at a later date. I'm really pleased to welcome an all-star panel to Insight Group today. We have Alison Herzog, Marketing Director of Global Social Business and Digital Strategy at Dell. Alison Mack, Director of Marketing and Communications for GasBuddy. Dusty, who's Director of Content Marketing and Social Media at Autodesk. And John, who's the Global Product Lead for Airbnb. Moderating today's session, we have a good friend of the Insight Group, Jack Edgar from the Craftsman agency. And finally, you are very much a vital part of today's discussion. There are almost 1,000 of you signed up for the webinar today, including marketers from FedEx, Verizon, KPMG, Volkswagen, Starbucks, Blooming Brands, and many more. So please do type your questions and thoughts into the chat box. We'll be sure to incorporate these into discussion throughout the webinar. The sooner you ask, the better. One last piece of housekeeping. We will be sending out the recordings for the webinar, and that should arrive in your inbox in the next couple of days. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick off the webinar with our first poll, which should be coming onto your screens now. So as that poll opens up, that is, what is your greatest challenge in relation to your storytelling? Is it clearly defining your storytelling and narrative? Difficulty to communicate the story within your industry? Hard to tell your story with the budgetary constraints that you're under, or internal resources? So I'm just keeping that poll open for a few more seconds, so do get your answers in as that comes in. And looking like we've got a clear winner. So I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that poll is just now closing, and I'll be sharing the results of you on your screens now. So as that comes up, we can see you've got a whopping 40% discussing with clearly defining their story and their narrative for their brand. And then next up, very similar numbers, internal resources and difficulty to communicate. So I'd like to hand over to Jack, our moderator for today. Jack, are these results surprising to you?
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Fantastic to be here. To some extent, I mean, really, what it does is give us a pretty great place to start, because I suppose the key to this opportunity, the key to this challenge is firstly defining your brand story, defining your brand meaning before you go about communicating it. So that is a great place to start. And I'm actually going to start with Alison from Dell, because I know this is something which you've really kind of focused on over the course of the last few years, and I suppose something that is a relatively specialty to you. So Alison actually pointed me in the direction of a pretty great TED talk by Simon Sinek, which is called Start With Why. So I'm in turn going to point the audience towards that. But fundamentally, he notes that the natural start to kind of understanding where your storytelling begins is to ask yourself, why do we do what we do? So Alison, why is that question so important in the context of defining your brand story?
Yeah, hey guys, I feel like, so just I think going back in history, and for those of you who studied marketing in college or wherever you happen to learn about it, if you go back into the history section of marketing, the reality is when products first started, there weren't choices. There were very simple options in terms of you were just grateful that something was produced at all. And so brands did not have to differentiate themselves. They didn't have to think about what their purpose beyond creating grinding flour or whatever it happened to be. And so there was no choice. There was no need for storytelling. And obviously in our world today, there's a proliferation of choices. There are startups every day. It's about how do you differentiate and how do you separate yourself from the choices and also drown out the amount of noise that exists out there. So, as mentioned, if you haven't seen the TED Talk from Simon Sinek, Start With Why, I highly recommend that you guys Google it, invest the time. It's not that long, but he really starts with, you need to understand, why do you do what you do? That's at the center of everything else, of your storytelling, of your narrative. If you don't understand as a company, why do you do what you do? It's going to be really challenging, I think, to build what that narrative is, that really clear, authentic, trustworthy narrative watch that TED Talk. I think that'll be really helpful. I think the other thing is, our media use has changed. We pick up our phones on average 150 times. Apple's come out with the screen time thing. I actually felt great because I looked at my screen time usage last night to see, is mine actually 150 times, and mine was less. And part of that is mindfulness and trying not to be attached to my phone and not being present with the people I'm with, but the reason it matters is if we're not leveraging something truly meaningful, something that our audience can connect with and resonates with them, then we're not going to cut through that noise. It's not going to reach them. And so in terms of how do we create something that's clear and that really resonates with our audience, I think it starts with understanding the why. And then I think it's really defining what our purpose, our mission is. At Dell, Liz Matthews, who's the SVP over brand and experiential marketing, has done a fabulous job of really defining what that brand purpose is, what the vision is, and making sure that, employees know it is. It's really simple. It's about driving human progress, which is very easily remembered and something that we can all convey. And, I think the last part is just as you're developing these narratives, again, remembering purpose, mission, and then getting into the emotion and just the neuro component as well. It's then, making sure that with any good story, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and then making sure that our audiences can connect, that they can mirror or see themselves in there. So I think there's a lot of tactics, but I think in today's society, we really expect that purpose, that mission, and especially with millennials and Gen Z growing, that is just ingrained in who they are, that they want to see that differentiation through, well, why should I buy your product? Why are you better than somebody else? And not just from a product perspective, but how are you making the world a better place?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you point out, as product marketers, it's very, very easy just to go straight into the story of what it is we do, or indeed what it is our product does. So for you, Dusty, how do you keep reining things back and actually asking that question and reaffirming the answer to that question about why we do what we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, in terms of, I really love, Allison, everything you just said. I think in terms of like one thing I want to underscore is your mention of authenticity. I think, being able to sort of find something that your brand can sort of own uniquely is a really, really important piece of it. I do think that people want to know features and functions and things like that, but I think it's less important now because in a lot of ways, like features and functions are like base level expectations. That's not how people differentiate anymore. People differentiate with a story, with a narrative that does resonate, just as Allison was saying, with what they care about. And I think, at Autodesk, one of the things we think about, right, we make software for people to design and make things. And I think for us, we look at one of the sort of core story behind our purpose is thinking about, okay, the reality of the world is that demand is growing for more things, more products, more resources, et cetera. And the reality of the planet is that resources are finite. So we're going to have to get a lot smarter at how we design and make things. And so, that's something that for us at Autodesk has become a really fundamental and important core part of our why or our story is, look, the reality is demand's growing, but the other side of that is that we have finite resources. So we need to be able to design smart and efficient ways to, ensure our own survival on the planet. So I think for me, again, the thing with product marketing is, there's a time and a place for it, but that's not how brands differentiate anymore. That's sort of baseline expectations.
And that challenge must be made, harder when your product perhaps is, so strong and does have a kind of core differentiator. So it's kind of coming over to you, Allison. I mean, so, GasBuddy starting off as a website, now an app. It's a very, very good app. It saves people money. It's easy to use. So it would be very easy just to get sucked in to talk about the value of the app and just to talk about how easy it is to use, etc. So how do you kind of stop doing that so that you're not just kind of doing feature-led marketing and actually rein it back into, again, this overarching story of really why you're doing what you're doing?
Right. That's the great point. So the problem that we've always had with GasBuddy is that we tend to see people using the app a lot more when gas prices are high, right? Of course, if gas prices are low, people don't usually use the app because if prices are already $1.99, they don't really see the need for that. So our struggle here and our constant work through on this is like, how do we keep on reminding people to keep on using this app, even though it's out of our control what gas prices are going to be? And basically, it is about storytelling. It is about creating a feeling for people where that would encourage them to open the app even though prices are low. And the way we've been doing that is basically using the whole brand mission of ours is to create the feeling of empowerment, right, of control. And we have used various different tools to try to create that type of feeling. So yes, prices might be $1.99, which is very low. However, the chances of you being quote unquote ripped off is still very high. So prices are at $1.99 at one corner, but if you drive around the corner, you could see it at an even lower price at $1.89. So therefore, that's a 10 cents a gallon difference. So what we have been doing is basically creating the messaging about taking control over your life, right? There's very little things in life you have control over. I can't control traffic. I can't control if my boss is going to be in a really bad mood today when I walk in. But these little controls that you have in life, such as, maybe controlling where you can save money and where you can shop. And that's how we've been trying to use that type of messaging with GasBuddy for the past couple of years.
That makes sense. So again, finding that fundamental theme and pillar and ensuring that you stick to it. In the case of GasBuddy, empowerment. In the case of Autodesk, Dusty, the worlds of design and making kind of converging. John, you obviously work for a kind of small company out of the Bay Area called Airbnb, and I suppose your entire brand is based on storytelling and I suppose celebrating the stories of Airbnb users. With that being said, how has the Airbnb brand story kind of evolved since its inception?
It's a good question. I think to some degree you don't want it to evolve too much, right? You want it to be expressed in different ways. It's like, Nike has had Just Do It for decades, and anyone on earth can quote that is their story, that is their brand. But they always come up with crazy new ways to express it, and we try to do the same thing. For us, it's interesting what Allison was saying at the beginning about start with why. Our mission is to make anyone in the world feel like they can belong anywhere. And that's a feeling, to other Allison's point, that you want to make people feel. If people aren't feeling something when they see your brand or they hear from your brand, that's a problem. It can't just be transactional. And everything we do supports that. But the interesting thing about it is it started internally. So it was something that the founders had as our sort of internal mission. And when our CMO joined, Jonathan Mildenhall, my old boss, he said, this was back in 2014, he said, guys, this is an incredible mission that everyone here is so bought into it. Why don't we tell the world about it and make it our marketing as well? And I think that's paid dividends for us. And then you cited it right. So it's letting our customers, our travelers tell the stories for us. One thing I've noticed in this whole world is that it can be so easy to be so close to your brand and your company. You think everybody cares about it. You think everybody's laying awake thinking about whether to use Airbnb or not, or and it's
they're
not. I mean, I'll be honest. Airbnb I think did an amazing job in advertising. When I arrived at the company 2-3 years ago, I had never seen an Airbnb ad. And everyone was talking as if everyone's seen, well, we did that campaign last year in Brazil, and surely they must know this and that. And it takes a long time. It takes a long time to really get that story out to the world. So we're doing the best we can.
I was going to say, I regularly fall asleep thinking about GasBuddy, which probably doesn't help with my screen time, which you were kind of referring to earlier, Alison. That needs to be reduced significantly. It's interesting you said, John, whilst the individual stories which kind of contribute to your overall narrative can change, the fundamental narrative kind of underpinning everything does not change. And I suppose in the instance of Airbnb, I don't know whether this is deliberate. From personally, I've seen a shift away from not just telling the stories of the users and their fantastic stories of travel and adventure, but actually focusing more on the hosts themselves. And again, the hosts are an fundamental part of that feeling of belonging. So was that a deliberate shift, or?
Very much so. Yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's just highlighting different sort of stakeholders, public stakeholders, right? So our hosts in some ways are our customers. They are our traveler facing community, and they are a community. And that's for another webinar, but I think imbuing community in what you do is good if you have the opportunity to do it. I'll give you a few quick examples of how we can express belong anywhere different. There's the Super Bowl ad from last year, which came together literally. We heard that there was space available 4.5 days before the Super Bowl. And it's that spot, this was just after the 2016 election, where it was actually didn't talk about walls specifically, but it was just close-ups of all different types of people from all over the world, and saying how, we believe everybody can belong. We didn't even put our name on the ad. That's one expression. This week, we launched something for Airbnb for Work with DeMarcus Cousins, the NBA star. He's moved to the Bay Area. He doesn't know anybody. He just joined the Golden State Warriors, and he's staying in Airbnbs to kind of figure out where he wants to live, which is a use case of ours. And it's just kind of pithy, funny, behind the scenes of him with these hosts in these homes in these different neighborhoods, kind of trying to find his place and we help him feel like he can belong in San Francisco. So those are wildly different ends of the spectrum, but I think Allison nailed it at the start of this webinar. As long as you know who you are and what you want to say, then that's the hard part. Then it's just fun to find all the different ways to express it to all different audiences.
And if you're a
John,
host,
that's brilliant. I now want to stay in Airbnbs just to figure out where do I want to move to. So smart.
Exactly, or be a host in the hope of DeMarcus Cousins puts a request to stay at your home, and I think I'd probably reduce the price quite considerably. Some really nice examples there of how you achieve this feeling of belonging, John. And again, in a relatively short space of time, you said you had 4 days to pull that Super Bowl ad together. A perfect example for those listening in, perhaps who feel as if they don't have the time to develop this. There's always a way. And to really hone in on some specific examples, we actually got a great question from Emily Sherburne, who is listening in, and it's for Alison Mack, and she ultimately just says, what exactly have you done to try and create this feeling of empowerment and control through the app?
Oh, that's a great question. So what we have been doing is that, and I think you're going to go into this a little later too, but we have been trying to show people how much they can save, but not just from us, right, from the GasBuddy brand telling you how much you can save, but actually using what our users have shared on social media and creating that to let people know how much they have saved. So there's a lot of great tweets that we get on a daily basis of people talking about, how they literally drove an extra mile and they were able to save $5 in regards to their fill up. So we started creating this monthly series because we saw that this was going on, and all of that was creating so much organic shares already, that we do this monthly series called GasBuddy Saves, right? And really what we do is that we go through social media, we find somebody who have basically talked about us, right? And then we basically interview them. We do a quick little profile piece on them, and then we share it out there. And these people come from all different backgrounds, whether, or, if you live in LA or Birmingham, Alabama, or, Idaho, everyone, and no matter the income that people have too, that's what we found to be very empowering. So we have really, the short answer is we have been using what our users have been telling and then sharing that out to our community to let them know, hey, you can feel this control too. And that's what we've been doing.
Fantastic. And thank you very much for your question. We've got a couple more coming in, which is brilliant. And we've got one from Henry Solomon, which is a brilliant question, which ultimately just asks, how does your story and your storytelling differ or compare to your overall marketing messaging, your mission statements, etc. So this is drilling into, actually, we've got our narrative, what we feel is our brand story. How does this then, communicate itself into individual piece of content, individual messaging? I'm going to come to you on this, Dusty. What's the process by which individual messaging is created, however you're still very much in line with that predetermined narrative? Is there the chief story officer kind of sitting in on every meeting to kind of make sure we're in line? How does that work on a kind of day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, storytelling at Autodesk is so core to who we are and what we do, because that's essentially how we empower a lot of our customers. That's what they're looking to do to create their customers. So again, in a lot of cases, we are very much B2B. And so we need to enable our own customers to help sell their products to their prospects. They need to be able to tell stories. And I'll give you an example. When somebody's designing a building, for example, and pitches will go out to design, in architecture firms and things like that. And those firms, when they're pitching ideas for buildings and things like that, they're going to come back to the client with sort of a 3D walkthrough experience of that building, like a VR sort of experience. A lot of the tools that we create enable people to even do those, right? Create virtual reality experiences, and then the actual design of the building itself. So that fundamental understanding of the importance of storytelling is sort of implicit at Autodesk. And so, I think that makes my job. I'd love to be the chief story officer, but I think that helps my job, right? Because I think that the fundamental understanding of the importance of storytelling is implicit at the company. And I think the way that we see it is it's totally a bottoms up and a top down thing. So we have overarching narratives and sort of a purpose and a narrative around sort of helping to design and make a better world. And then what we do is we have sort of ways of sharing that. And then we've got storytellers from across the company who are helping to evangelize that and tell that in different ways to different industries, right? So, our core industries would be like, construction, for example, manufacturing, media and entertainment. Everybody in those fields, however diverse they are, they're all trying to design and make things. And so each sort of industry group will start to put their own flavor on what that looks like. And then in terms of actually sort of fleshing out or building out the story, what we do. So one example is my team puts together a publication from Autodesk called Redshift. And that is very much sort of our sort of owned media or brand publishing hub. And so that's where we'll tell a lot of our most future forward stories. We're featuring some of the most, progressive and prolific customers that we've seen who are exemplifying what we see the future of design and make being. And to me, that is sort of a central hub around which the entire company can help start to up-level this idea of design and make and help pull together what might seem like different ways of expressing that story, but really are, coming back to how people are designing and making a better world.
We're definitely going to come back to Redshift, the platform, because it's a fantastic example of how brands can be publishers of stories. But I suppose to come back to your question, Henry, in terms of what exactly is storytelling as compared to marketing messaging, mission statements, etc. Marketing messaging is a fundamental way to tell your story, as is your mission statement, as is every single interaction that your customer service execs have. The fundamental piece is, as Dusty mentioned, is making sure that everyone is aware and leveraging that overarching narrative, and actually developing a platform where people, again, are not only aware of it, but are excited by it, are engaged with it. Do you have something similar over at Dell, Alison? Or are you looking at this enviously and thinking maybe we should?
No, I think it's certainly a challenge that we all deal with, which is how do you, once you've defined what the heart of your company is and the why, how does that then translate into marketing messages? What do they look like? How do you continue to, I guess, have diversity in message, you know, in terms of having entertainment, educating, connecting, these different things of how do we create that. You know, I also think about a challenge that we have at Dell because we are such a huge company and we're global, and most people think of us as, you know, laptops. But the reality is where our business is really our sweet spot. The laptop, you know, the consumer end is very important to our business, but you know, where we have a strong footing that's really critical to our business is the B2B end. It is security, it's virtualization. And so for Dell, it is having this very diverse solutions offering that most people don't even realize they're using Dell every day, even if they don't have a Dell laptop. You know, so then how do we translate our why into messaging? And then how do we create a standard so that at a corporate level where we're very clear on what the message is, that then transfers down to the local level. And so I think that, again, starts with having everything very, very clearly defined. And I think it's also about having diverse audiences within your workforce. I'm really passionate about always making sure that you're hiring people that don't look like you and sound like you, because that's how brands make missteps, is when they don't have the right people in the room and they miss something. And so then I think, again, translating that, it's having that core, it's, you know, defining it clearly, and then it's making sure all the people who are content creators are trained in it, understand it. And then the last piece, I think, is listening to your audience, which we've heard mentioned. You know, Allison had mentioned it as well, which is, you know, what are our customers saying? What is social media saying? Digital conversations. Customers are more than happy to say what they think. And again, that's where you sometimes find, oh, something is off brand, it's off tone, it doesn't resonate. I think there's a great Yoplait example of many years ago, they had a commercial where it was like two bridesmaids sitting, you know, after a wedding, eating Yoplait, talking about how delicious it was and amazing, and rattling off like, this Yoplait is, you know, like Bachelor is, you know, shorter than you good, or, you know, like all these different funny things that they thought, you know, the audience could connect with. But then you have the glaring piece of, but what bridesmaid sits after a wedding eating Yoplait at the wedding? Like who's serving Yoplait at a wedding? And so Yoplait, you know, like, and not to say anything bad about them, because the point is we were more product focused, or we were trying to find our way years ago. And now Yoplait just put out this great ad in the last few years of, you know, starts with something controversial where it shows a woman breastfeeding in public and she's eating Yoplait, and it goes through all these different, you know, vignettes of moms, you know, being judged for whatever they do or don't do. I'm breastfeeding, I'm formula feeding, whatever it is, but they show people in a natural setting. And so that goes back. And then at the end, you know, it's like, I'm feeding my child. Yes, it might have more sugar, but like, look, you know, the purpose they go back to resonates with the audience, and it's true to their mission. And so anyways, I think it's those pieces of standardizing, being clear on the narrative, and then training your own people internally to be those advocates, to be the checks and balances, and then using your customers as the final checks and balance. And they will tell you if something if it is not on brand, not on message.
Hey, Allison, this is Dusty. I just wanted to say, 100%. I think, you know, when you're developing marketing messaging, you know, ideally from a product marketing perspective, you're trying to think about like, who are the audiences you're targeting? What do they care about? What's important to them? And to me, that's sort of the place where you can start to transition from marketing message to storytelling, is, you know, understanding who your message is intended for, and then starting to try to examine them and understand and listen to them. What do they care about? What motivates them? What scares them? And start to build story narratives around those things. And you will, you know, by doing that, you will draw in the audiences, and you can actually, you know, with storytelling, sort of test some of those messages to understand whether or not they really resonate, whether you're developing, you know, messaging in a chamber, or whether or not that messaging actually resonates with them.
And I would say even taking, you know, like sometimes we think, oh, our company's not sexy. Like, how are we going to tell a story? And I think, you know, even going down to our product, you know, to your point, Dusty, our products have a purpose. They're solving a need, or frankly, we wouldn't be in business. And so even as an example, energy companies, you know, sometimes they get a bad rap, or, oh, they're terrible, they're evil, they're trying to overcome this because there have been accidents in the past. But think about if we didn't have energy, like think about how that would impact the world, even just with the new Mary Poppins movie, and they show how these gentlemen are lighting the streetlights one by one. You can do the storytelling in that aspect, because what do our lives look like because of energy? What would they look like without? And it's down to, babies in the NICU. Like those types of stories are compelling and meaningful, and it is connected to the product. So I love that.
Totally.
And on that basis, Dusty, and actually I'm going to tip my hat to Valeria Phillips in the audience for asking this question. For you, and indeed many of the audience members operating within the B2B space, there isn't just one person that you need to engage and generate a degree of trust with, but instead you have a whole committee of decision makers and kind of budget gatekeepers. How, therefore, do you take your storytelling and use that to aid you in that goal?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point. Yeah, I think, that's a fundamental truth, at least, in our world, in the B2B space. We're selling into larger companies. Of course, we sell into small companies as well, but a lot of our business comes from larger companies. And when you think about how that process goes, any of us who have worked at bigger companies, you understand how the process goes of buying things, right? So for us, we're selling technology into, large design and make firms, construction firms, and architecture and manufacturing. So we just think about like, okay, what's the process of doing that? You need to convince a whole bunch of people. And what happens is traditionally product marketers tend to focus on product. And so, yes, that's great and really important for end users, but there's so many other people that are involved in the decision making. And so that's where you get sort of the rise of popularity around things like ABM, right? Account-based marketing, where you're thinking about the account holistically and thinking about sort of the buyer as not just a single person, but an entire committee of people that need to be influenced and that all have sort of their own things that they care about. So, for example, you're going to have, of course, the end user, and they're going to care about, does a product do what I need it to do, et cetera. You're also going to have the end user's boss who's like, hey, how can I implement this tool set and manage it across the many users in my organization that are going to be using said software? You've got procurement and the things they care about. You've got legal and IT. And, those are things that are really important. So one example of storytelling for us would be, hey, if we're trying to sell, say, a cloud product or a cloud-based product into a larger company, and in some cases, historically, we might come across maybe a more old school IT person who's like, whoa, no, cloud, not comfortable with that. It's not secure. And so then we'll go, okay, let's think about what that person cares about. They care about security. That's the core thing they care about. So then we'll start to put together a story around why cloud is actually in many cases more secure than having local software running on your desktop computer. And we'll put together content and storytelling that will help the person help the person sort of overcome some of those fears and challenges. So again, I think it comes back to thinking about holistically, how are your products being sold into or sold to your target audience or audiences, and how can you create stories and use storytelling as an effective mechanism to bring everybody along? That's an important part of that process.
So yes, ultimately your overarching narrative and story should not get in the way of creating that very targeted, benefit-driven content, which might speak to a number of different audience segments.
Yeah. 100%. I think, we start with end users, and I think that's fair. And a lot of times from my experience, I spent time in product marketing, quite a bit of time there. And what I learned was that a lot of times product marketing tends to be feature and function oriented, because the product development team is thinking specifically about end users, and they'll go out, they'll talk to end users, try to figure out what their problems are, and then build products to help solve those problems. And then what they'll do is they'll take that messaging, hand it over to their product, their marketing counterparts, and say, here's the why. Here's the why we're building this. And the marketers, sometimes will just take that and go, okay. And it tends to be a list of features and functions. And I think that's where, as a marketer, you can step back and go, okay, that is a crucial audience. And in many cases, the end user, in many cases, could be the most important audience, because they could be the one bringing to their organization, hey, you know what, we're using this old school thing over here. We should be doing this more modern way. It's a lot more efficient. It's going to be better. I'm going to be able to get more done. And then they can be the one that sort of carries the torch and helps drive some of that change in their organization. But it's just, you can't stop there. You've got to think about all the other people that are involved in the decision-making process.
Exactly. Do not let your overarching story get in the way of that personalization. And again, coming back to Airbnb in that vein, that theme of belonging, relates to both the end user, but also to the owner of the home and those renting it out. So it's just about finding that personalized content within that broader theme. We're actually going to move on to a slightly different area of the topic, and Chelsea Warren in the audience has actually provided a perfect segue for this. And we actually have our second poll. So I'm just going to get just a kind of slight nod to the Insight guys to kind of get that ready. But before we do that, John, I'm just going to quickly come to you with Chelsea's question directly of when you pitched your Super Bowl ad and it didn't have your name on it. Did any of your senior execs kind of raise their eyebrows to that? What was the response?
It's interesting. It was the opposite. It was the founders, Brian and Joe and Nate, our founders' insistence that it not have our name on it. And the reason is interesting that they don't want it. They didn't want it to feel like an ad. And in fact, I think everything that you do beyond your ads also affects your brands. So, for example, in Charlottesville, you mentioned our hosts. When we had a lot of white nationalists that were on one side of that protest, staying in Airbnbs, the board and founders got together and said, can we kick them all out? Because we really don't want, that's not about belong anywhere. We don't want these folks in our homes. Very controversial. Arguably half the country would disagree with that decision. But that point of view, it's funny, I have a friend who is an ECD at an ad agency. He said, I've never actually seen an Airbnb ad, even though I've been deep in the industry for years, but I read all about that, and that had more influence than anything on me to stay in Airbnb. Obviously, there are people who feel the opposite way. You could say the same thing about the Kaepernick stuff. But I think a big part of Belong Anywhere, a big part of what we want to be is not we're not a typical marketer that just slings ads. I think that's something that's distasteful for us. Obviously, easier said than done. And if you're smaller and upcoming, and I've been there, harder to follow this rule. But you want to be as authentic as possible, and we have a very pure story. And so I think that was just a pure expression of it.
Perfect. And that as probably the audience can see, that relates quite strongly to really the way in which we're measuring the success of our storytelling. Clearly, in relation to you, John, if it was purely about clicks, then then perhaps not having the Airbnb name on there might have undermined that somewhat. So clearly, your kind of success criteria is different to that. So we're really interested to see what the audience thinks in relation to their storytelling and how they might measure success. And somewhat unsurprisingly, that is really quite sporadic across the board. So we've got about a third saying, high level engagement metrics, so impressions, views, clicks, and then kind of audience, slightly deeper audience interaction in the form of sharing, commenting, in person interaction. Thirdly, kind of lead gen or form completion. And then finally, we do not measure success in relation to storytelling. Alison from GasBuddy, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you firstly, this question, how you go about measuring the success of your storytelling, and then of course the big fat why.
Yeah, it really depends on what campaign we're doing. So there are certain big campaigns where we are really just about the awareness, right? So I would say, therefore, we don't really put a hard number to it, but there are certain campaigns that we do where it's really focused on lead generation. So of course, then, we do measure, we do have measurement tools where we're like, okay, well, was it worth us spending X amount of money to put on this campaign? So for example, there's this one campaign that we just put on a couple of months ago where we were trying to help people understand that, you don't need to be frugal Francesca just to use GasBuddy, right? That everybody should be using GasBuddy. So we did this kind of tongue-in-cheeky, pithy campaign about GasBuddy is the way for you to get the perfect fill up. So we're like, well, how do we do that, right? How do we basically put out this message that that's what we're all about? So we had this idea where we're like, well, why don't we start giving out free fill-ups to people actually named Philip, right? Like make it basically, we're personifying the whole fill-up idea. So the purpose of that was really like, okay, it is lead generation, of course. We're trying to get, this actual campaign to be covered in certain trade publications, but also we're thinking about audience interaction. So the more people named Philip, Felipe, Philomena, Phyllis who are sharing this content, that would make us happy. So of course, there's not a million, there's not a lot of people named Phil in the world, but there's a core user named Phil in our ecosystem. So that campaign went really well in regards to just audience interaction. So as I'm looking at the screen, there were a ton of shares, there were a ton of comments, right? There were a ton of people adding their friend named Phil about this campaign. But when it comes to like, well, did we get a ton of downloads that day? No, but we felt that that was a very successful campaign because, basically anybody named Phil out in the world would hear about this, and it helped with our brand too, where it's personifying the fill up and helping people connect to buying gas. And so that's how we saw that campaign go.
So on that basis, what about the fear of potentially alienating parts of your audience? So, I mean, as a Jack and not a Phil, Alison, I feel as if GasBuddy is neglecting me. So how did you kind of balance that? Was there a discussion about, we might actually, disengage part of our audience?
What was so funny? We had long conversations about the name Phil, right? Like, well, is it gender inclusive? And I was like, well, there's a lot of people with last names, with the last name Phillips, so that would work too. And it's funny because we actually started getting in touch with famous people named Phil. So Wilson Phillips Band, right? Busy Phillips, Dr. Phil. So it became quite hilarious. And no, we weren't afraid of alienated. We actually did a social media campaign where we're like, share your perfect Phil with us. So we got a ton of people sharing, their fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Phillips, who was perfect in their eyes, right? So that's very funny. But no, it was definitely, we were leaning towards humor. We were leaning towards, being, basically being more human. That's what we were really leaning toward. And I think it really worked.
Oh, absolutely. So, but to focus on a serious note in relation to this issue of potentially alienating kind of part of your audience, great question from Bailey reading the audience to you, Alison Herzog. And you mentioned earlier that actually being kind of controversial in some ways is actually a kind of can be a positive thing. And Bailey referenced the most recent Gillette commercial, which I'm sure we've all seen. And actually says, well, in that commercial where they ultimately kind of move out of their traditional swim lane of what they perhaps P&G traditionally saw as masculinity and what it means to be a man, they've moved out of that and actually seen, in some areas quite a negative backlash. So how do you weigh up this potential opportunity of around being controversial, but also the potential threat of alienating audiences?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And my initial reaction is hallelujah, and it's about freaking time. I mean, that when Gillette came out with that, it's so interesting to me, the reaction, because in my personal example, my husband is a stay-at-home parent. And so it's becoming much more normal. But when Gillette had ads, back in the 50s, we wouldn't have, it would have been, does not compute. But, the world has changed. The way that we live has changed. And Gillette has needed to, I think, grow up with their ads. And again, it all goes back to, have you defined your why? And sometimes, I don't think your why should really change, but sometimes it does have to evolve because culture has evolved. And Gillette started out with, very functional ads. They showed men in the military, with military haircut, and actually, it was a very functional product. They moved on to, I think it was the late 70s, and they were just selling sex. It was like, showing a woman in a bikini on the beach and implying that if you had, and they've grown up to now this, like, this is what good looks like. And we encourage men, to continue to raise other men who know what good looks like, and to course correct those who are treating other, boys and men and women and girls improperly. And I think that message is needed. And I think, again, sometimes you piss people off, and I don't think that's bad. I think that means you stand for something. And so I actually personally applaud Gillette for doing it, because it showed they were willing to risk. I don't think, certainly I'm sure they were thinking, oh, this is going to create a ripple, and, there's benefit in that. But I think also, again, taking a stand, John, like Airbnb you were mentioning, you guys have taken stand in a lot of things, and that makes me respect your brand. Nike, when they came out, just this last year, agree with it or not agree with it, they took a stand and they said, this mirrors our belief system. So, personally, I always want to be sensitive to other people's thoughts and feelings. And again, like I said, I'm really, diversity of thought is important to me. But I applauded Gillette ad because they stood for something. And I don't think it should be offensive, because my husband is a wonderful man, and he was not offended because he saw, goodness, like he does those types of things. He is all those wonderful things, and we need to just, I think, do more of that. So anyways, short answer is good job, Gillette. Like, thank you. And let's see more of that.
Absolutely. I completely agree, Alison, and exemplifies that point that we mentioned at the very start of not being completely bound to a predetermined kind of narrative that might have been established, however many years ago. Clearly, P&G and Gillette specifically have made a shift, and rather than moving into that and doing it somewhat apologetically, they have communicated it in the strongest possible way, and again across the board, and have really kind of set the parameters for the rest of the team in the same way, and probably a slightly less controversial way. Dusty and his team have done at Autodesk, in terms of, again, saying this is what our narrative is, this is what we stand for, let's get everyone on board with that. We are rapidly running out of time. I have no idea where 45 minutes have gone, and we have had so many questions come in from Emily, Chris, Nick, Joe, Paul. Thank you so much for your questions. Now, what I'm going to say, unfortunately, we don't have time to kind of actually get to those questions, but for everyone I've just read out, and for everyone else who send a question through, I'd highly recommend taking this to the kind of social media waves, and you should be able to find Alison, Dusty, John, and Alison, Mac on Twitter. So feel free to kind of punch them out. Of course, another great place that you can ask them is at the Brand Marketing Summit, which undoubtedly Aaron will tell you about in a minute. But I just want to say thank you to our amazing panel for all their insights. We've literally just touched the surface and the top of the barrel, but yeah, thank you again for your kind of key take homes, and definitely a take home for me is not to serve yo play at a wedding. That's kind of what I'm underlining moving out of this discussion. But thank you, everyone, and I'm gonna hand back to Aaron to kind of finish us off.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jack, and thanks a lot to the panel as well. I'd say a big thank you to both Alisons, John and Dusty. There was some really great insights shared there. I've been making plenty of notes, but I'm sure I've missed a few things. And just wanted to let everybody know that the recordings will be available. Hopefully by the end of the week, we should be sending a link to those rounds, so you can watch any time on demand. If there's any colleagues you'd like to share the discussion with, or you just wanted to listen back yourself. Please do look out for that. And as Jack mentioned, all our panelists today will be speaking at the Brand Marketing Summit West, which is taking place in San Francisco at the end of May. And you can see some of the other speakers on screen now that are also speaking at the event. So I'll be sending around a brochure after the webinar. Please take a look at the event, and if you can join us, we'll have a discount for everyone who's attended the webinar as well. So thanks again for listening in today, and a last thank you to our panelists and Jack for moderating, and I hope to see you on another Insight webinar soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.